Hi, everybody. This is the last session, so it's been amazing amounts of ideas and density of thought and thickness of thinking. It's just been extraordinary. I thank everyone involved, of course, Marianne and the whole Engendering Archive group for putting this together. I think we're all just full of thoughts as a result. I'm going to read a very brief introduction, and then we're going to just get going. Utopia derives from the Greek utopos, meaning good place, in contrast to utopos, which means no place. It reflects the creation of imaginary good places that do not necessarily exist on any map other than that of the imagination. Such experiments in conceptual thought attempt to create physical manifestations of a different, perhaps more humane humanity. One might think of them as interventions in a world overrun by the spectacle. Even if their duration is brief, these interventions reflect the desire to give form to what Ernst Bloch might call the not yet conscious, that which anticipates and illuminates what might be possible. And because utopian thinking is always communal, it also implies history and collectivity, the coming together of people within a societal situation. You cannot have a utopia of one. An idealized experience with oneself would not qualify as utopia in the philosophical sense. Others have to be pulled into the action in some way. Art can satisfy these conditions by creating objects, narratives, situations, interventions, deliberate transgressions, where ideas, however difficult to absorb or accept, are made manifest in form. Artists have the capacity to respond to the ambiguities of history, the erasures, the disasters, the eclipsed memories, the violence that we've been discussing for 2 days, in very visceral ways. They create images, metaphors, narratives that bring the private into the public into the private, and turn the conversation to the nature of democracy insofar as they create a location for public discourse, thus demonstrating that social transformation can begin in ideas, and ideas can lead to action. Artists are able to work as individual agents of change, or they can align with social movements, making work that is overtly subversive or subliminally so in its ability to create a meta-discourse about how the story is told. They can hover between popular culture, the world of the intellect, or adroitly cross geographic political boundaries as citizens and activists. It is my pleasure to have Walid Rad, Din Kulé, and Shirin Neshat with me today. These three artists are each established practitioners of innovative strategies and ever-evolving forms that revolve around a strong ethical core and create micro-utopian moments where the imagining of the future becomes possible. They also each use the archive in extraordinary and unique ways. Each has a large international record of solo exhibitions, museum shows and acquisitions, biennials, documentas, innumerable awards, and great bodies of writing about their creative production. Between them, they have worked in film, video, photography, installation, sculpture, performance, documentation, truth and complex truth, and the literary essay. They have found ways to position themselves in relationship to their place of origin, its history, politics, aesthetics, and immediate concerns. For each, a city and region, injured, progressing, healing, injured again, healing again, has been at the fulcrum of their production for some time. They have each suffered history profoundly, and they have each affected their own generation of artists and those that have come after. They have shown that it is possible to be successful in the complexity of the global art worlds and still be of real significance to the progression of history, ideas, society, and form. Walid Rad was born in Lebanon. He emigrated to the US in 1983. He is now an associate professor of art at Cooper Union. He is well known for his work with the Atlas Group, an imaginary foundation designed to research and document Lebanon's history. He continues to use multiple forms of presentation, visual, literary, and performative. His most recent project involves the conceptual installation of the history of art in the Middle East, and his presentation today is called We Can Make Rain, But No One Came to Ask. Din Kulé, born in Vietnam, left when he was 10 and immigrated to the US. Den was at first best known for his woven photographic images of scenes from the Vietnam War, or the American War, as it is known in Vietnam, and from the Cambodian-Vietnamese War. He has returned to live and work in Ho Chi Minh City, where he has been integral to establishing an artist-run exhibition and residency space to develop the work of Vietnamese artists. His large video installation, The Farmers and the Helicopters, captivated MoMA audiences 2 years ago with its mix of historical footage and narrative. And Din's talk today is called Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, 30 Years of Silent Resistance. Shirin Neshat, born in Iran, has focused on issues of democracy and human rights, often working through the medium of photography, video, installation, film, and activism. She is perhaps best known for her photographs of speaking through the body and for her multi-screen epic installations reflecting the dynamics of gender, religion, and art in the Arab world. Her first feature film, Women Without Men, which won the Silver Lion for Best Director at the Venice Biennale in 2009, is based on Sharnish Parsapour's 1989 banned novel of the same name. A small video called The Fall, reflecting the famine in Somalia, recently haunted the pages of the New York Times site. Shirin's talk today, Artists as Catalysts for Change, and we will begin with Walid.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for this invitation. About maybe 8 years ago today, in 2004, I initiated a project about the history of the car bomb in the Lebanese wars. The project itself was titled, My Neck is Thinner Than a Hair, A History of Car Bombs in the Lebanese Wars, Volume 1, 21 January 1986. Now, in that project, I began with very simple questions about each of the more than 3,000 car bombs that detonated in Beirut between 75 and 91. The questions were, what facts are available about these detonations and who was behind these crimes and why were they committed? But then these simple questions led to others, such as, what happens in and to cities when residents, buildings, streets, and neighborhoods are exposed to the constant threat of assault? And in the end, the project created forms and ideas about Beirut. Now, these forms and ideas seem to me today to be as much about the Beirut of yesterday and today as they are about Baghdad, Kabul, Gaza City, and possibly about New York, London, and Madrid. I would like to acknowledge at the outset that this project would not have been possible without direct and indirect collaborations, contributions of my friends, colleagues. I worked very closely with Tony Shakar, an architect and artist in Beirut, Jalal Toufiq, a writer based today in Berlin, and Bilal Khbez, a writer and political commentator. But I was also aided in this project by real, but also by imaginary conversations with two men. The first was a conversation with Youssef Bitar, a retired Lebanese army explosives expert who investigated almost every single car bomb that detonated in Lebanon between 75 and 91. The other conversation was with Georges Semerjian, a renowned photojournalist for the Lebanese newspaper An-Nahar, who covered the Lebanese wars extensively in the 70s and 80s. Today, I'm going to present a very short version of the original 80-minute presentation. I will talk for about 10 or 12 minutes, and then I will show you an 8-minute video segment, a segment from a video titled, We Can Make Rain, but No One Came to Ask. Between 1975 and 1991, 3,641 car bombs were detonated in Lebanon. These cars killed 4,387 and injured 6,784. The car bombs were placed most of the time in areas with high population density in order to kill, destroy, and terrorize as much as possible. In 1986 alone, 15 massive massive car bombs were detonated in Lebanon. 12 of the car bombs exploded in Beirut. 2 were in the south of the country, in the cities of Sur and Saida. 1 was north of Beirut in the city of Jounieh. On 21 January 1986, a car bomb detonates in the neighborhood known as Furn al-Shabak. It's a neighborhood in what was then East Beirut. This was not the first car bomb of 1986. The first major explosion occurred 20 days earlier, on the 1st of January 1986, also in East Beirut. And this was not the last car bomb of 1986. 31 days later, on the 24th of February 1986, another detonation will kill, destroy, and terrorize some more. Now, for this project I was doing, I suppose that any one of the 3,640 car bombs would have been an adequate place to start. I chose the 21 January 1986 detonation arbitrarily, or as arbitrarily as anything is ever chosen. I also think of this chapter, this study, as the first of the more than 3,641 chapters, one per car bomb. Now, the original 80-minute presentation is organized in 4 parts. In part 1, I spend around 20 minutes or so gathering or presenting all the logistical facts about the detonations. What kind of car was used? What kinds of explosives were packed in it? Who was injured? Who was killed? Which hospitals they were transported to? How many buildings were destroyed? In other words, in the first 20 minutes, I talk extensively about logistical facts. I gather them. The second part of the presentation was I would also spend 20 minutes or so tracking and identifying all those responsible for this detonation, as well as their criminal and political motives. Who stole the car? Who packed it? Who paid the man to steal it? Who knew what at what point? Part 3, which is the part that I'm going to begin with, which is the part I will present, begins this way. On 21 January 1986, a car bomb detonates in Furn al-Shabak, in East Beirut, at the intersection of the Damascus and Bustani roads, 30 meters from the local headquarters of a right-wing Christian militia. Kifurk Semerjian. Kifurk Semerjian, better known as Georges Semerjian, a staff photographer for the newspaper An-Nahar, hears the explosion from afar. He immediately seeks an elevation, a rooftop or a hill, to locate and photograph the rising plume of smoke. He must have driven fast to the neighborhood, for he arrives at the same time as rescue workers and residents, all trying to save somebody, anybody. Now, his negatives from that day reveals that he pauses, he stops at the wall of heat, smoke, and fire. He circles the intersection, but within a minute or so, he pierces through to the epicenter of the detonation, to the 5-meter wide, 2-meter deep crater on the side of the road. He will document the panorama of destruction in 3 rolls of 35mm film. Semerjian has done this before, and he will do this again. He will more or less photograph the same scenes, the same objects, the same forms. There's always a rising plume of smoke. There's always a wall of heat. There's always a crater. The arrival of rescue workers, the injured being carried away, charred bodies, destroyed shops and cars, stunned residents standing inside buildings whose facades have been blown away, the arrival of investigators, views of the crime scene, views of the scene of the crime from an elevated perspective, piles of cars and debris being removed. But for some reason, Semerjian always returns the next day, the day after the detonation, primarily, it seems, to photograph municipal workers, municipal workers now charged to fill the massive hole produced by the detonations. The workers always recognize him. They stop for a moment and wait for him to photograph them. Semerjian takes his time. Perhaps he's waiting for something, for someone to enter his frame and interrupt the casualness of it all, but this won't happen today. In fact, this won't happen in 3,641 more todays. Semerjian eventually exposes a frame. The workers go back to work. There's nothing unusual here. Just another crater to fill. Just another crime scene that will not be left intact, confirming what the residents of this and other neighborhoods seem to have known all along. There's no need to keep the crime scene intact when the forthcoming prosecution will be political and not juridical. I spent 4 years working on this project, working with Tony Shakar and Bilal Khbeis to collect the material and immaterial facts and to identify those responsible. I spent a lot of time in the neighborhood documenting streets, storefronts, buildings, and inhabitants, but by 2005, something very strange started happening to me. At first, I was taken aback by what my cameras were beginning to record in this neighborhood. My photographs and videotapes began to manifest colors. They began to manifest colors and lines that were, at times, significantly different from the ones available to my eyes, from what I saw in my viewfinder. I photographed crowded streets only for them to appear deserted in my negatives and videotapes. Open storefronts appeared shut. Faces appeared as backs. A building's walls disappeared from its facade, revealing the building's shell. At times, my images recorded buildings as datable structures, as architectural drawings. The space at the intersection of the Bustani and Damascus Road appeared increasingly flat, literally flat, in the sense that all facades appeared to me to be painted surfaces, like an Ellsworth Kelly painting or a hollow movie set. Needless to say, this surprised and frightened me. But I suppose I should have expected this. I'm today convinced that I had been warned indirectly by Lebanese photographer Semerjian and his photographs of car bomb detonations from the 1970s and 80s, the photographs he took in neighborhoods that had been devastated by car bombs and other detonations. Semerjian's photographs had already revealed to me how distinctions between private and public, between the inside and the outside, were yet another casualty of car bomb crimes. The insides of bodies, stomach, flesh, bone, now on the outside of bodies. The contents of stores and buildings now propelled onto the streets. Buildings without facades affording passers-by unhindered views of private living rooms and bedrooms. But I had also been warned by someone else. I had been warned directly by the writer Jalal Toufiq. In 1994, 10 years before I even began this project, Toufiq imagined a photographer who can only see Beirut at the speed of war. In Beirut, Toufiq warned, an artist may become sensitive to, and may give expression to these scrambled distinctions, inside, outside, private, public, past, present, future, but only in his or her artworks. An artist may see things in his or her photographs, his or her aesthetic facts, that may not be in accord with what was available to his or her eyes while gathering these facts. Moreover, Toufiq accurately predicted that in such instances, an artist is likely to say to himself or herself the following words: "You have seen nothing in Beirut." But the artist would feel compelled to photograph this nothing, safeguarding it for a future when his or her documents may become referential again. Between 2004 and 2006, I was seeing things in my photographs and videotapes from this neighborhood that utterly confused and scared me. Of course, my initial reaction was to dismiss these images by treating facets relating to what I saw in them in purely technical, conventional, and formal terms. I would attribute strange color shifts to processing errors. I would regard the distortion of buildings, streets, and other spaces as digital noise produced by my camera's recording mechanism or as heavy-handed formal manipulations on my part. By 2008, I came to believe that what I was seeing in photographs actually belonged to the world itself, to the 50-meter perimeter in furnished Shubbak around the Damascus and Bustani roads. I came to believe that the color shifts, the distortions in my images, have nothing to do with how photographic technologies mediate the world, and even less with the conventions of two-dimensional representations. The distortions are in the world itself. I came to believe that something in this neighborhood, in the time and space of the neighborhood, may have been affected not only by the 1986 detonation, but also by every other war, skirmish, assault in Lebanon since 1975, maybe even before. Something that may be manifesting itself to me, but only in these photographs, in an artwork. And so tonight, this afternoon, I'm going to conclude by showing you a videotape, or 10 minutes I will show you, a videotape titled, "We Can Make Rain, But No One Came to Ask." This videotape, the videotape itself is much longer, but I'll show you a segment, constitutes my central contribution, the only contribution that remains for me to this project titled, "My Neck is Thinner Than a Hair, A History of Car Bombs in the Lebanese Wars." If we can please dim the room lights to black and show a segment of the video until it's time to move to the next speaker. think we will stop here. Thank you.
I guess I need, okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm a little bit jet lagged. It's middle of the night in Vietnam right now, so please excuse me. I'm going to tell you the story what happened culturally to Saigon, as it's known today as Ho Chi Minh City after the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and how the city was able to rise once again recently as a cultural center of Vietnam after years of being under strict control by the Vietnamese Communist government. Saigon has always played a central role in the South. It was the cultural and intellectual center of the South. It was also the economic engine. Under the French colonial government, Saigon was the government center for Indochina. In 1949, it became the capital of the state of Vietnam, and in 1954, it became the political center for South Vietnam after the country was divided under the 1954 Geneva Accord. After the end of the war, Saigon was quickly renamed as Ho Chi Minh City after the founder of the Communist Party. Saigon was stripped of its identity, given a new identity that's closely attached to the history of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Now, Saigon have always been the center of the anti-communist, so it was government. So it was very interesting that the Northern Communist government quickly stripped of that identity and replaced it with a communist identity. Many of the streets in the city were also replaced by the names of Vietnamese Communist Party leaders. The strategy for this was basically to kind of insert the identity of the communist history into the city, but also a kind of to eradicate the memories of the city. Events in the city are no longer possible to be able to locate with the original names are now gone. The original name of the streets are now gone. Today, Saigon once again has reclaimed its cultural and economic importance. It is the biggest city in the country with the population of 10 million. 60% of the population are under 36 years old. It has become the economic engine of the country once again. Culturally, it has taken the lead from Hanoi. Politically, it's still under the control of the Communist Party in Hanoi. One of the big misconceptions of the Vietnam War was that it was primarily a war between the US and Vietnam. The international community for years had ignored the fact that the Vietnam War was also a civil war. After 30 years of fighting, on April 30th, 1975, the Vietnamese communists took control of Saigon and all of southern Vietnam. In the view of the communist government, it was extremely important to have total control over Saigon, the heart and mind of the South. Systematic effort were put forward to break the will of the city, erase its memory and its identity. A city without memory, without an identity, is much easier to control than one with an identity. As soon as the Vietnamese communists took over Saigon, intellectual and Southern regime officials were let go of their positions at university and other important public institutions. Many were rounded up and sent to labor camp, and a large number had to flee the country. Most of the publications pre-1975 from the South were banned and continue to be banned to today. For a period of time, books burning became a regular event in the city throughout southern Vietnam. The communist government encouraged the city population to destroy much of the pre-1975 publications, implied punishment for those trying to hide books and other printed matters. Writers, historians were banned from publishing their works. For years, today, many are still banned from participating in public discourse. Art and music pre-1975 were considered a product of neo-colonialist culture and banned from public. A large number of artists from Saigon also left the country. Those who stayed behind were banned from teaching or displayed their work in public for years. The artists who stayed quickly came under the control of the government-run Ho Chi Minh City Fine Art Association. The artists have to follow the recommendation of the Fine Art Association on themes that they can explore if they want to exhibit. Since 1975, all cultural events required to obtain approval from the Department of Culture. The process involves sending images of works or sketches of installation with a statement to the Department of Culture for the censor to view the material. 5 subjects that you are advised to stay away from are war, religion, poverty, politics, and sexuality. Yeah, it doesn't left anything to do for us to do except paint flowers. Even without the exhibition permits from the Department of event without the exhibition permit from the Department of Culture were quickly shut down. And the culture police took over, so you could end up in jail. And this policy continued to today. Saigon was basically under the state emergency from 1975 until the early 90s. With the collapse of the USSR, its biggest economic aid partner, the Vietnamese Communist government had to open the country or facing the collapse of the economic system in the country. Along with the opening up the country, they also have to loosen up the control of the people. Today, people still refer to the city as Saigon. Only in official capacity that people refer to Saigon as Ho Chi Minh City. Artists are slowly regaining their independence from the government control. Many have stopped being part of the Fine Art Association. It took a while for the artists to find their feet again. And one of the first artist space that opened, independent artist space that opened, was Blue Space, opened in 1997 to showcase artists that have been overlooked by the government. And this space is actually opened by the wife of one of the artists, a senior artist that was a true believer of the Communist Party until he moved to Hanoi in 1954 and sort of lost faith in the whole system. And for years he was living in Hanoi, and the only escape he could get was to paint. And so it was run by Mrs. Nga, and for a while was very active, but until 2004, Mrs. Nga had some health issues, so now the space is not so active as before. This exhibition, Saigon Open City, was initiated by a commercial gallery owner, though, to Tuyết Mai tried to organize an international exhibition called Saigon Open City in 2005. We brought in international curators, Gritia Gawiwong from Thailand, and artist Rekrit Tiavani. And for a while, everything was well, and then the government sort of censored. For as far as we can find out, is in part for strong political content, and in part as a punishment for its ambition and independence, because the Fine Art Association were not happy that the Saigon Open City was trying to do their job, but in reality, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to do something like this on the scale, but nevertheless, they still feel it's their job, and so somebody else shouldn't cross that line. So the project was banned, and unfortunately, we were not able to open the show. And there were some amazing artists that were participating, that Leon Gallup, Nancy Sparrow, Yoko Ono, and many more international artists, as well as local artists that range from young artists to senior artists. And the Set Art is a space that myself, Tiffany Chung, Tuan Andrew Nguyen, and Hatu Phunam opened Set Art in 2007 to provide an alternative to the government-controlled Ho Chi Minh Fine Art Cities Association spaces and the Ho Chi Minh City Fine Art University. Curator Zoe Butt joined us 2 years ago. When we started out, the university, the Fine Art University was basically gave up teaching contemporary art because, well, the fact is they don't know anything about contemporary art. So they are now finally admit that they're teaching traditional art. But also another thing that we were interested in, that for the young generation of artists, they have no idea how to do research. They have no idea how to think critically. The Fine Art University and the school have been feeding them things and they just accepted it and without questions. And so when they came to us, we were sort of kind of at a shock of the kind of thing that they accept without questioning at all. So we started San Art as a place where not only to have exchange between local artists and international artists, but a place where we want to have workshop and to train them to the basics, to just learn how to do research for their project, but also start to ask questions to go deeper than what the government is giving them. So beside the exhibition program, and we also have a lot of lectures and workshops. After 4 years, we're planning to open, next year we're planning to open a laboratory program where we are running a sort of like intensive graduate program for a group of young artists with mentored by international artists. We hope also to train the next generation of artists and art organizer. In Vietnam, there's no curators or art organizer. Everybody just sort of start doing things by themselves. So we need to train the next generation so they can start independent cultural spaces. and eventually taking over SanArt as well. There are also other new independent cultural space opening in Saigon. There's Himiko Cafe, which is sort of a cafe that's run by Himiko Nguyen. Once in a while, she have exhibition of young artists. Zero Station is Nguyen Yu Hui, an artist that's just opened up about a year ago. And their project, found and run by Rich Stratmaitran, another artist. And Quan Các Bê Tông, found and run by artist Ngô Lực. Quan Các Bê Tông is probably one most interesting project, is that they act like a guerrilla group. They do hit and run projects so they don't have to be under the censor. But the government is actually actively looking for them, so. It is amazing to see how many independent spaces are open in Saigon at the moment. Saigon today is more culturally vibrant than Hanoi, although we are still under strict control by the government, but we all are able to find room to maneuver around this control. Another development that have great success also is that have taken up on the virtual world. In the last 10 years, the resistance had moved to the web. Websites on the arts and culture in Vietnam and Vietnamese diaspora community have popped up in Europe and the US. Besides blogging on current arts and cultural events, banned books and other printed material that were hidden from destructions are now managed to make their way out of the country and being uploaded onto this website. This archive has become extremely important in the struggle to reclaim the history of the city and of the South. The interesting thing about it is like most of them are started by Vietnamese diaspora who are my age or younger, and many of them don't have direct memory of Vietnam. But growing up in the West, they started asking who they are. And the only way that they can answer was to look for the information, to do research. And fortunately, many of the material are based in many of the universities in Asian study in America. So that have helped a tremendous in terms of the materials coming out. And also all the material that was supposedly burned in 1975, a lot of brave souls have kind of smuggled it, and amazingly or not, they were smuggling up north to the communist states. But apparently there were other like-minded people that didn't want this history to be destroyed. So it was saved up north as well as it was smuggled out of the country. So today we have access to all this material than ever before. Talawast was published in Berlin. It is premier forum on Vietnamese intellectual for Vietnamese and intellectual worldwide. It's founded by chief editor Phạm Thị Hoài. It's updated daily from 2002 to 2009. In 2009, it became a quarterly journal. One of the specialty of Talawast was that I actually have archive of some of the dissident literature group from Hanoi that was banned for years. And it's amazing that somehow in Hanoi they were able to keep this material, and now it's accessible to everyone, except in Vietnam, but I'll get to that. Tiền Vệ, founded in 2002, based in Australia, is a literary magazine central to writers, poets, and literary critics, both within Vietnam as well throughout the diaspora community. And then you have Diacritic, founded by a group of Vietnamese American covering arts, culture, and politics, and diasporic Vietnamese artists network based in America. This website are free from censorship of the Vietnamese Communist government, but they always have to be very careful about what they write, since it might get the people involved who are still living in Vietnam in trouble with the Vietnam Communist government. Most of these websites are blocked in Vietnam, but people do manage to find proxy site to get access to them. Recently, with the Arab Spring, they have begun another crackdown on Vietnam. Vietnam, according to some researchers, is more stricter than China in terms of control. Facebook is blocked in Vietnam. So the crackdown began about 6 months ago, and SANART went through a pretty tough time with the cultural police. One of our events was on a writer that was allowed to be republished by the government. And then quietly they withdraw the book. Of course, we didn't know. When they censor something, they never announce it. And so we got trouble with them. And, but what we found is that they are scared of our network. So when they came and they tried to shut us down, and we refused to go. So they now force us to apply for permission for all talks, and we're not allowed to use our network as widely as before. They asked us to send only 500 emails out instead of the 1,000 that we used to send. But what happened is that, so we decided to start network with other organizations in the city. And now we're doing all our educational program with different small artist-run organizations. And as a result, our network is actually bigger than before. And I think as Vietnam is growing and the economically it's not doing well right now, but nevertheless it's still growing. It is understandable that people start to question things and start to want to know more, and spaces like SANART provide an alternative to the government kind of version of reality. So more and more people are coming to our space. So it's understandable that the government is a little bit scared of us, and for us, it's a little bit kind of like a drug that kind of feeding us, and we like the fact that they're scared of us, and so therefore we must do something right. So anyway, thank you.
Good afternoon. I have to confess that I feel a little bit inadequate because I'm not an intellectual, so I haven't prepared a paper to read, and I'm an artist, but I have nothing to show you. I have not brought anything because I wasn't really going to talk about my work. I really want to share with you some thoughts, some observations, and personal experiences regarding that question of, can artists be catalysts for change? And first, let's begin with this recurring phenomena of artists as activists. And when you think on that topic, the first person that comes to mind these days is Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist who has been relentlessly fighting the oppressive Chinese government. Then you think about a number of other artists, including Walid, who's sitting here, Emily Jassier, who have organized and taken the leadership in organizing other artists fighting and protecting the rights of the construction workers for the upcoming Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Museum. And then I think of myself as someone who has taken the position to fighting against my own regime and really fighting for social justice in Iran, particularly since the election, the fraud election of 2009. But when you think about this artist and numerous other artists that will follow, I'm sure, it occurs to me that there's a certain pattern that seems apparent, that most of these artists are not Western. Most of these artists are coming from politically troubled countries, whether living in it or living outside of it. They're affected by it. A lot of these artists have personal narratives, experiences that directly affects themselves, their community, their family, and therefore they're invested in these questions of political issues. And this idea of activism is almost like a natural impulse. This is not so in the American culture. I'm generalizing to some degree. And therefore, I just want to reflect on this question that artists becoming activists is not a strategy, rather it's a result of the social, political, cultural, religious environment that these artists inhabit if they're in exile or if they're in fact living in their own country. Then let's talk about the challenge once that artist decides to take a position, take a political position. How would that affect their work? Would they reduce this activism in terms of only speaking about politics and the question of democracy? Some people separate their work from the political stand. Or would they indeed express those ideas also in their art? If they do that, in fact, how would they balance this question of art, what is utterly most important, that you want to be an artist, that your work is not judged upon the subject matter, but basically you can be discussed as an important artist universally? Or is it that basically you may appear as an opportunist, that you simply utilize political issues to become central discussion for other people? Can you be effective as an artist activist? Can you really expand beyond the art world and your immediate constituencies and communities and really bring change? These are the questions that I really feel that every artist who has really come close to embark in that question of social responsibility, and yet an issue that is utterly tabooed, I'm really speaking about the art world, that you really have to situate and ask yourself, what position am I taking? And plus, am I just preaching to the converted? And can I really bring change? I've been dwelling on this question for a while, and I really think the answer is yes, that artists can be a catalyst for change. And then I think about the time that we live in. It's a really moments of crisis. There are revolutions happening in the entire world, the Arab Spring, the Wall Street protest, the riots in England, the riots in Madrid. This gentleman just spoke about Vietnam. Therefore, the artists cannot really distance, or can artists really distance themselves from the question of social political reality? Can we really exist in this bubble that is independent from the social events? There's something else going on, and I think that Walid could be one to speak about that artists are becoming very ambitious, and artists are not willing to be indulging simply on this commodity-driven activity. We are very good at making things that sell, hangs on the walls of galleries and museums, but we would like to push beyond galleries and museums. We want the mass audience. We want to get closer to the real people. For that respect, I moved towards cinema, and now I'm working with performance. It's an immense pleasure to get close to the popular culture and to be able, if artist's job and tool is communication, to be able to get close to the real people. Now, the question of what it's like to be an Iranian artist, and this is really an extreme case. As you know, we've had an oppressive regime since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. But ever since the election, the catastrophic election of 2009, there's been an extreme measure in terms of all artists, in a way, have become political if they dare to reflect on what is going on. If you're an artist living in Iran, meaning not just visual artists, but filmmakers, writers, you are very, very possible for harassment, censorship, arrest, imprisonment. Today, we have some of our greatest talents, some of the best filmmakers behind bars. In fact, some of us are fighting for their release. Jafar Panahi is perhaps one of the single most important filmmakers who is banned from making films for 20 years, is banned from leaving the country, etc. If you're living outside, you're subjected to a life in exile. The government would not allow you to enter the country. Therefore, on both sides, you are really at risk. At the same time, and the absence of the freedom of expression, oddly enough, this situation has empowered Iranian artists. Now, I'm not talking only about visual artists. We have become absolutely central to the social political discourse in Iran. Iranian artists are there today to inspire, to provoke, to mobilize, to bring hope to the people. If you're living outside, you have an ability to report on the lives of the people inside. There are endless amount of work that artists do that becomes a direct threat to the Iranian government. What has happened for me as an artist, although I live outside, I found myself that I'm actually fighting two battles: the battle against the Islamic regime and the battle with the Western culture. In so many ways has reduced our identity, our culture, to the minimum. So in my work, in the last film, Woman Without Men, I decided to readapt a novel by Shahnoosh Parsipour, by a woman that was in prison for 5 years and has been living in exile for some sacrilegious questions. But most particularly, this story takes place in 1953 when we had the coup d'etat exercise by the CIA. I realized that I have so far subconsciously reaching toward narratives and concepts that really addresses historical and contemporary issues. The CIA coup d'etat in Iran and the revolt of the people against the local dictators and the imperialists was central and important to revisit at the time that we had our election in 2009. And now I'm working in Egypt, making my next film on the subject of Kulthum, who died in 1970s, but was central as a symbol, an icon for Arabic, pan-Arab unity. And to this day, many Arabic, including particularly Egyptians, look up to Kulthum as the single most important artist of the 20th century who brought the notion of democracy and justice and activism. This is all about I have prepared to tell you, and I hope that in the discussions that we will have, we'll be able to expand on them. Thank you.
I'd like to open it to all of you first and see if you'd like to begin the conversation. Otherwise, we'll do it among ourselves first. No, I am now. I think it's so interesting that Shirin and Din both didn't choose to show their work. So I want to ask Din that question, because Shirin talked about why she chose not to show her own work today. But Din, I'm curious what your feeling was about that, since you've made so much work about these questions in Vietnam and about history and the archive. Use the mic.
I think sand art is part of my work. So that's why, I think today in this context, I feel like it was more appropriate that I talk about sand art and the context, how that work came about, rather than showing, my well, I guess you could say artwork.
Then can you talk a little bit, and Shirin, you as well, and Waleed too, about what is you talked, Shirin, a little bit about this notion of this evolving identity that I think is increasingly happening in the West as well, where artists are really pushing the boundary of what it is to be an artist and how one functions as an artist, and moving increasingly away or dematerializing the object and really engaging in wanting to engage in the social sphere and create public space. So can you talk a little bit about that? How you think this is happening, or why you think this is happening now?
I can only speak for myself. I think in terms of forms, let's discuss that for a minute, where it used to be that with our education came our focus, our style, like either you're a photographer or a painter, etc. For example, I never studied photography, I never studied video, I never studied cinema, I never studied directing, performance, and I did all of those. I think many artists are redefining this idea of discipline and the idea of they really want to blur the boundaries in terms of forms. And I think this has something to do with the popular culture. I mean, the technology, the fact that technology has allowed us to move very rapidly in a very transitional way between forms, and not have to have studied it for years and years and simply bring people to help us. But it's directly, I think, a frustration of many artists where this notion of collection and the idea that ultimately art practice remains as this exercise of creating work that hangs on some wealthy people's walls, which I like, by the way. But there is something frustrating about narratives and concepts that are essentially evolving around the suffering and social political issues, and yet ultimately you're indulging in a world that can care less about that world. And I'm talking in a very extreme case. I'm very happy to be in the art world, but I think there is this element of cinema and other kind of forms that are more directly connected to the popular culture. Steve McQueen, myself, Julian Schnabel, began to make films that become distributed. People can buy DVDs for $10. They can watch it at their home. They're forced because of the commercial pressure to make narratives that are somewhat less enigmatic, that are accessible, that are made for general public. And therefore, it makes me to rethink about my ideas in a way that can maintain its value as art and yet communicate to the general audience. I find that idea of me coming close to notion of entertainment incredibly exhilarating. And so I think we just want to get closer to the popular culture, and for too long, and people can contradict me on this, I'm sure, I feel that museums and galleries are very exclusive, elite spaces, that you must have an education in art history to be able to comprehend the history of art. But with film, you really don't need to have an understanding of the history of cinema, for example. So, I mean, these are my own understandings and sort of conclusions, and I'm sort of carrying on with both, but I think there are many, many other artists who are taking the same position.
Waleed, do you want to jump in? No. Okay.
I think in my context, in Asia, there's two factors that I found that's led us to be more active on the ground rather than in a gallery space. Is that number one is basically the end of the Vietnam War, the end of the Cold War in the region. For years, the U.S. support kind of dictatorship regime throughout the region, whether it's in Korea, Taiwan. So the freedom for artists to express themselves were highly censored. And so when the U.S. sort of kind of pull out a little bit, and democracy sort of arrive in places like Korea, Indonesia, artists are actually start to be able to discuss issues that for years that they haven't been able to discuss. And then another aspect is that infrastructure. We don't have museum or galleries like over here in the West. So that we have to start spaces that in order, if you need to talk about these issues, you need to build your own space in order to talk about this issue and to bring in the audience. So it's all about kind of necessity rather than trying to change the system. It's just that there's no system, so we just have to build our own system.
I want to talk about something that Teddy brought up, which was a phrase of the critique of the metaphorical, and his desire, the way I interpreted it, as wanting artists to move away from the metaphorical and to be more direct and more focused on action. I'm not sure I'm representing this correctly, but this is how I heard it. So I'm curious, and I ask Walid this too, I'm curious how you think about that, because when you begin to try to engage with a larger social world, then the question is, what is the form of that? What form does that work take? How do you talk to people? There has been a historical use of metaphor and image always, and it never was simply for an elite audience. It's the way that people understand things through the unconscious and the imagination. So how does one then think about the nature of form if the practice is transforming as you've articulated it?
Well, there's so many loaded terms, right, in that sentence, from the idea of engage, right, the larger world. And the other thing would be interesting to go back to something maybe Teddy said, was about why should the urinal come back to the bathroom, right? That I think is a
yes, let's go back to that.
It would be interesting to think, why does it need to come back to the bathroom as opposed to go out to the living room or, go somewhere else, for example. So in a way, it's, if one thinks, let's say the history of the car bomb, at least in this particular project, where one would think that the most urgent thing to do is to, let's say, gather logistical facts, build a juridical case, accuse those who have escaped juridical prosecution, and name them. And that would constitute, let's say, proper engagement. But then after maybe a few years, at least working as an artist, because I think what is available to me as an artist is certainly different from what is available to me as a teacher, or as if I function as an activist. And I try very carefully to make sure that what is available to me as an activist is not the same, is absolutely of a different kind of make, of a different material than what is available to me as an artist. So I'm in this neighborhood, I'm videotaping, and because I tend to work with facts, but the facts in question are never and only purely economic facts, political facts, sociological facts, but they're always also aesthetic facts, as they are affective facts. So how to then engage an aesthetic fact, and then what is available, that what becomes manifest in an artwork becomes for me equally as urgent, and in this case it became all the more urgent than what was available to me sociologically or politically or historically or architecturally. And then it becomes a question of what do you do with that kind of, like certain things, certain colors, lines, shapes, and forms are manifesting themselves in an artwork that one has produced in this particular space. What do you do with them? Do you trust them? Do you need a confirmation that these are about that space, or they're about, let's say, a sensibility you're projecting on that space? Or is there something in the case of the car bomb in Lebanon, then one realized that there's 30 years, one can see similar things maybe in New York, like if one has a 9/11 every single day, certain things will happen in a city like this, where you can't trust, let's say, the police for your security, when you might not even be able to trust the local militia or your building for your security. There's consequences to things like this, and one of the consequences might have been manifest when people were told, let's say, that they would have to go on the subway and they'd have to have their backpacks searched at any moment, right? That's happened right after 9/11. It continues today. And one of the kind of manifestations became that people would start to wear backpacks that were made out of clear plastic, right? So in other words, you constantly kind of now start to have to proclaim your innocence in the absence of any crime you've committed, and you allow somebody to look at a realm that was private immediately. You're saying, oh, look, I'm not a terrorist. You can see immediately inside my bag. Now, my sense would be that maybe after 3,000 9/11s, it would not just be backpacks that became invisible, but buildings themselves might become invisible, right? And in the sense that who would see these manifestations? Who would see that something has been affected in this space? And my sense would be that, among others, but artists, writers, thinkers, could be activists, could be cooks, could be dancers, may, in an artwork, in their concepts, become sensitive to these expressions, become sensitive to these shifts. But they may not be able to speak about them, but in an artwork, in a concept, in a gesture, in a sentence, you end up becoming sensitive to them. And one of the consequences might be that this may look completely metaphorical. That, let's say you make an image of a building and you show its facade as being completely transparent. One consequence might be, oh, you're using this metaphorically, or you've become an utter formalist, as if these are accusations, right? What if, in fact, you look at a building and in an artwork, its facade has disappeared, and this is literal. There's nothing metaphorical about it. And it's a literal relationship, but only in the artwork, to that building, to what happened to that time space. So in a way, it follows maybe literally what you're saying about being very literal, but I'm not sure it's at the expense of the metaphorical. The other side of it would be that you become very formal. You might look at things in incredibly formal ways and have to suffer the consequences associated with that.
Do you want to say something to that? No. Anybody want to respond? Yeah.
Hi, this is working. Thank you so much for being here. It's an incredible honor to be sitting in the same room as the three of you. And I just I recently read something on an art blog that said that the most controversial thing about contemporary art these days is that there is nothing controversial about it. That a lot of artists, especially in the United States, are working with very, very safe topics, safe subject matters. And I find that to be something that's very untrue for all of your art practices, especially. But what I would really like to know from a personal perspective is, especially in light of the recent Ai Weiwei detention, is how has working under oppressive regimes and or under the shadow of oppressive regimes forced you in some ways as artistic celebrities, so to speak, forced you to renegotiate and rework your own artistic practices, knowing full well that being activists, artist activists, can also endanger you and prevent you from being able to actually produce art. Right, that you can be stopped at any moment by an oppressive regime and be forbidden to become an activist, so to speak. So how has that forced you to renegotiate your own artistic practices?
I think the most difficult has been to find that balance in between making work that now that you have the attention of the government and of Iran, you have the attention, really, it's very interesting. A taxi driver in Tehran has maybe seen my film, and my mother often talks about, isn't it amazing that it's piracy, you know? So art travels very fast to Iran. It echoes, and people know what you're doing. And so suddenly you become very conscious of this balance you must keep in mind, whether you're making a film or a photograph or whatever, that somehow communicates to the average person on the streets of Tehran and yet to the art world. And that your critics are suddenly becoming the Islamic Republic, Iran, and the New York Times. This is the span of the situation. The other balance you have to keep in mind is the question of not allowing the political issue to dominate the aesthetic and the value of the work that must survive beyond this time and place, and ultimately will go down the history as something significant, not only relating to today's election, you know. And so I find that extremely difficult in terms of communication between different audiences, artistic versus non-artistic communities, Eastern versus non-Eastern communities, And then also to do a fair balance where the work really provokes thoughts on those issues and does not simply aestheticize people's sufferings. And yet, it doesn't become didactic. I'm sure Walid in his own, I mean, I think the difference between us is I always find how smart is Walid, and I'm so emotional. And I think a lot of us have to decide how do we approach this subject, either rationally or emotionally. I think with me, it's more intuitive. I don't have a theoretical basis for what I do. It's a reaction. I've never been like that. I do a lot of research, lots and lots of research. It takes years to do a film. It took 6 years to make the movie that I made. But I'm not really an intellectual. I have a gut reaction and emotion, and I go for it. But I find this, people think it's very easy, but it's not. And that's my experience.
She's coming with your microphone.
The images that we did see of Walid's film, and of course they do echo a lot of the work of Din and Shirin that I know, and that is showing things that aren't there. You said that suddenly your camera saw things that you didn't see, and of course the film shows things that aren't there, and that, I mean, to me it's a metaphor for all of your work and for what art can do. But what I was so struck by what happened this afternoon, that it's a metaphor not only for the artwork, but it's also for the work that you do. For example, setting up these spaces that are spaces where artists and people can come together, or the activist work that you do. But you know, when I think of Women Without Men, it's all about seeing things that aren't there. That is what it means to make a film. It isn't just, you know, pointing and shooting a camera at somebody. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more in terms of what it means to be a catalyst for change. Because Carol started by talking about utopias, and utopia is about something that isn't there, but that we can envision, we can visualize. What kind of change, and what can art do to catalyze change in terms of the media that you all have chosen?
I think when we set the space up, it was just a very simple idea that these artists need information, and we just provide the information. But along the way, it became very political act. It became such a political act that I think is probably one of my most political work compared to all other works I've done, which is kind of interesting because it started out quite innocently in a way. So in terms of, you know, the idea that we provide some sort of kind of alternative or utopia model, I think we're still struggling, trying to kind of find ways around things, and because the censorship system in Vietnam is quite strict, so we constantly have to kind of maneuver around things, around their policies. The crazy thing about it is that their policy is not very clear, so we constantly kind of have to change all the time. And I think that's one aspect that I found kind of interesting.
You talk to attention, which I've observed in Vietnam and in the art schools, as very traditional. When I took students to Vietnam, my students, I was then in Chicago at the Art Institute, several of them wanted to stay so they could learn to draw. You know, the thing they weren't getting because we were so theoretical. But this difference between the worlds that we often move in the States, and the way, the pedagogies that we create for our students versus this very, the model in his or her underwear in Vietnam, very just forever just standing there with the object drawing, is this enormous space of time that's been eclipsed there, that these worlds are so disparate. So I can see that you could be in a very complex situation trying to bridge that in any space that you would create. So how do you think, how will that occur? It's a whole other conceptualization of the way that one would learn to even think of oneself as an artist.
Funny you talk about drawing. My current project is about drawings. I've been interviewing 12 senior artists who draw beautifully, and they were all embedded in the war effort, and they make beautiful drawings of the war, but in a weird way, it has nothing to do with the war. So this is, I think for me, I'm trying to understand their world right now. And I'm trying to have a dialogue with their world, because I think for a long time, their world is sort of being dismissed. What they do is not, I think, in my context, it's not very valid anymore. And so this project for me was a way of trying to understand them, how they came and why they do this very beautiful drawing, intimate drawings. And perhaps, create a kind of understanding of where they're coming from, and perhaps they understand where I come from. And so, and that's what sand art is trying to do to a certain extent, to start to have a kind of dialogue between the older generations and the younger generation, because for a long time there's a distrust between the two. The older generation felt that the younger generation are experimenting with all this new medium as a kind of attention getting. Curators come and they only want to see young artists who make experimental conceptual work, and then they completely dismiss the senior artists. And so there's a for a long time the two were together, and now there's a split. And so now we're trying to kind of rebuild this split or connecting them again. And so this project I'm doing is one of the first projects. We're trying to kind of bring the senior artists back into the contemporary art scene.
Marianne, I would not necessarily say that I rarely think of an artist as a catalyst for anything. I'm more convinced that an artist is maybe more at the juncture of absolute aloneness, right, which is not sociological solitude, let's say, and a kind of collaboration, but it's not an active participation with other, but an untimely collaboration with artists to come, artists who have existed, writers, thinkers, others. So I rarely think of the artwork as in the service of anything. And then when I think of the idea whether an artwork shows something that is not there, I think in this seminar, in the wonderful seminar we had together, we talked a little bit about this idea of the surpassing disaster, in the sense of how rarely one is in a situation when you confront an event, a particular disaster that surpasses the limits we usually attribute to disasters, material, immaterial, long-term, short-term. And as a consequence, the world is affected. It withdraws, as Jalal might say. An artist subsequently becomes sensitive to this withdrawal, to this, how the world is affected and is no longer available to vision, and you record it, even if you know that the images you're producing are not going to be referential and may one day, you hope, be referential again, with the risk that in the meantime they will appear as purely formal, right? They will be or conventional, or that you're a bad artist. So this idea of seeing the nothing we talked about, I think is interesting, and it's slightly different from, I'm trying to think whether it's the same thing as what you say in terms of, does the artwork show something that is not there, or are you becoming sensitive to how the world is affected and hence you are trying to document a nothing, and that nothing is a thing that you're present to, you're sensitive to, in this rare instance, in the case at least of this neighborhood, where you become aware of the flatness of the landscape. It had developed a very particular notion of time and space that is restricted to very few people. Only few people have access to it. And then you come, you spend enough time, and you sense something. That I have more affinity with that idea of how the artwork functions to reveal something than I would with.
Teddy, why don't we take Teddy?
The Saigon City, number one, it was a big, big exhibition for Vietnam. I mean, there have never been an exhibition that planned to take over 3 museums, number one. And so that scared the government already. And the work, the first chapter was basically bringing back work of artists, international artists as well, local artists. But the international artists are all the artists that were making work in supporting anti the Vietnam War. So on some level, we thought that was okay with the government. But little did we know that they just don't like anything political. They don't want the artists in the country learn how to make political art, basically. So that, and then the people that were advising the city government whether about this project, which is the Fine Art Association. And the Fine Art Association were quite upset that we are setting up this exhibition because technically it's their job to set up this exhibition. We are stepping on their territory. So that's also play a big part in it. The exhibition wasn't actually banned. What happened is that the government were very smart in terms of how they censor the show. They say that we will have the license next week, and then next week we come around, they say next week. And to the point where our lease with the 3 museums, 1 week before it ran out, they say, here's your license, but it was too late at that time. So technically, they know if this project was censored right out, it will create an international scandal. So they drag us along until the last minute, and they say, here's your license. So we never censored. You have a license. But it was too late for us to carry out the exhibition because the museum never allowed us in the museum until we have the license. So they were very smart in how to kind of censor the whole thing.
Yes. Well, since Carol almost got me in trouble, but I guess I myself got myself in trouble. But I want to clarify, have a space to clarify, which is in the context of the amazing elaboration on the issue.
It's really
by
hard
Walid.
to figure out how to get Teddy Cruz
Yes.
in trouble, so I'm taking it as a compliment.
But it's an interesting situation because I'm thinking that as we rethink the role, all of our roles in a sense, we are reviewing our own procedures, and I'm thinking that as we continue to be interlocutors, I would say, encroaching into what I would call the war between the visible and the invisible. Of course, the metaphorical is a point of entry into the invisible and the role really of enabling other ways of seeing the world. There's no question about it. I mean, for a moment, in fact, I qualified it for a moment coming from Latin America because I became so dissatisfied with being packaged as a kind of magical realist when in reality we needed to transcend the kind of facility, the kind of facile way of packaging imagination through the fantastical in a sense. Of course, we cannot forget that that very genre was grounded on socio-political realities and so on. But what was shifting in Latin America had to do with a forceful kind of return to a kind of social realism of sorts that really reconfigure literature in many other fields. But nevertheless, it's not to say that it's about getting rid, of course, of the metaphorical, but to complicate it, because it's been somehow, or has remained self-referential in its own kind of obsession with being a noun, obviously, and not really a verb. And what I mean is that the metaphorical, embedded in the metaphorical, there are a series of procedures that can be extruded. And I think that's what I was referring to as a kind of functional relationship. And I think that you brought it up, Shireen, which is really wonderful, the notion of research. I mean, what was really compelling about the work, and first with Walid, in terms of really witnessing for the first time, I think, the kind of research that has gone into these years of really entering into this problematic, or Shireen mentioning how this research-based work has enabled her to really also contact other medium in order to engage this relationship not only with the issue, but with a larger audience. So what I'm trying to get at is that, and I wanted to recuperate it, is this process-based, the kind of necessity for a process-based research that, without sounding strange about it, begins to also suggest other modalities of the aesthetic. That research itself has its own, the kind of unfolding of the unpredictable, not only for the sake of ambiguity, but for shaping other aesthetic relations between the formal and the social. And I think that's fundamental to the work that we saw today, and in the reframing, really, also of the role of the artist.
The reason that I brought it back is because I know where that could lead if it were taken literally, and that is to a kind of flatness about solution, that work has to pose solution, or it has to present the problem so clearly that it can't be missed. But in truth, and I think this is to what Walid said as well, maybe, that what makes people want to change, what makes things happen at a given historical moment we're observing right now, it's unquantifiable, it's uncalculatable. You know, just when we think we understand a situation, something happens that completely unexpected, that we didn't know was going to happen, and it opens a door. And in my mind, art has that potential to activate that, to be a catalyst, I guess. I don't mind that word. But it's not necessarily a literal, it's not necessarily literal. It can happen in so many different ways. That's the only reason I brought it back, because I know you, yeah, okay.
I guess from Catalyst, I would want to return to this idea of a translator, which I think was a word that Eyal brought up. Part of what's been satisfying in this discussion is the resonances that it's bringing back to the previous one. And part of that has to do with ways that issues amongst a group of artists and issues that are at some level primarily concerned with architecture, in fact, have so much resonance for each other. And so Walid, for instance, your film, I think, I could not help but think of it in terms of some of the issues brought up in forensic architecture and the kind of Hamlet character that Eyal introduced us to. You know, my bones don't lie. These kinds of relations between the object and its translator. And so, in that respect, Clive's drawing, for instance, is also one in which the object and its translator kind of come into being with each other. With that, I wanted to just throw out this speculation, maybe, that each of these objects, that they start to have, in fact, new relationships to ways of being validated in a justice system. For instance, that in Clive's, there would be something that strikes me as a relationship to, I think it's called an excited utterance. This is when somebody gives testimony in a moment of great emotional stress, maybe after a traumatic event, and it's considered admissible evidence because there isn't a kind of transitional period in which to kind of edit and really recast the account. So there's a kind of veracity that's immediately invested in the object of testimony. So it's not really a comment, a question, but a comment.
I don't know how to formulate the question, because I'm just like speaking by thinking out loud. But a thing that I think is very interesting is just, or I would like to hear from you if you have any opinions how this issue of public and private is just like moving really strong in all these works. And Walid said a lot about that, so I was like picking all the things out. And I don't know exactly how to ask, because I think it's going to be an issue that's now happening in really different cultural contexts and under different circumstances. So maybe Beirut is an extreme circumstance that is like a permanent state of reception, but it's kind of different that what happens, for example, in Madrid, and I'm not talking about the bomb, but about the protests that were just like putting the city in a moment in a state of reception. And if you see how this issue of public-private is just like moving or shifting in a cultural ambit. It's a really vague question, because I'm trying to understand as well, but maybe you can say something about that.
I didn't say much about it, I just mentioned it, but maybe to elaborate a bit. You live in a city where there's a car bomb every day. You look outside the window. You want to know, you want to know, does this car parked down here belong to someone I know or not? So all of a sudden you start, I mean, I live in New York and I barely know who lives in the apartment next door. In a city like Beirut, like this, one of the first things that starts to happen is you start to asking your neighbors to confess their secrets, to immediately tell you their secrets. For example, do they have a daughter or a son? Are they dating someone? What kind of car does this date drive? And is it parked down here? Now, this logic happens not just in terms of cars, but it happens, and it doesn't happen with everyone, right? It doesn't happen in the entire city. It happens in a very small perimeter, it seems. 1 building, 2 buildings, 3 buildings, where you need to know everything that happens inside these walls. You need to know if this car down here is that car. Now the trick is, well, where does it stop? And where do you know that you've reached the threshold of the logic that has been in place here is different in the next 3 buildings, because they've developed a different system of figuring out how to know whose car is down there. Now remarkably, at least in Beirut, this logic remains intact 40 years after the war, even when the logic of each ghetto, of each neighborhood, not even a neighborhood, sub-neighborhood, 3 buildings, having developed a particular relationship to space and time. Even after the militias, most militias have been disarmed, even after roadblocks are taken apart, you realize, I mean, you notice that some things have remained intact even when all the rest have gone. Now, how do you sense it? Because the idea is no longer just to say the militias have been disarmed, roads have been opened, everyone is now just a citizen of Beirut, when you're not a citizen of Beirut. You're just a citizen, and you're only willing to die for these 3 buildings and nothing else. So in a way, you're not yet willing to die for the other part of the city that might come under, like in 2006, under Israeli bombings, and you feel, well, that's not my city, it's someone else's city, even if it's 500 meters away. Now, this is one just tiny thing, right, that happens in relationship to this logic. And I think the same thing happened with the backpack. When you immediately tell the police, I mean, the cops should have a reasonable doubt to search your backpack. When you wear a clear backpack, you're immediately saying, okay, please, this is that which is private, my backpack, is now public. Come look at it. That's just one event, one massive, vast, and extreme catastrophe, the limited effects. But this one produces this backpack. My sense, as I said, would be 3,000 of those, other things might start to become invisible. Now, I'm not sure how this is linked to the protest. I don't know what logic the protests have brought about, and I'm sure it must be interesting. Someone here must have looked at it closely and maybe can tell us.
I was just thinking about this question of the production of the space. If we just really follow this logic, this space is not static, but is produced by the social dealing and the physical conditions. So maybe I thought, because it was really inspiring for me. I come from Bogota, so I have experienced a couple of times this bombing system where your windows just like disappear in a second. So it's like kind of you're going, yeah, the private life is just like outside. And again, because this thought come from this morning as well when Diana was telling about the protests in Mexico City, and then was talking about the differences between the middle class and the indigenas that were more open for just going out in the street and producing private space in a public space. And then I was thinking about what is happening here. Then if you say like, yeah, they are the hippies that are just like camping in Wall Street or whatever, it's like kind of a group that is maybe more open to move from private space to the public and create a new kind of space in between. So it's like, I don't know if this is something that is gonna last, like this moving from private to public and the other way, and the examples you were telling were just like kind of negative experiences, but maybe are like other experiences that can be positive. Yeah, as I say, I really don't know now, but I'm thinking about that just because of this issue of the production of the space and creating cities with handle and dealing.
I know there's someone back there who wanted to. I just want to say very quickly to your, I've been thinking about this a lot, I've been writing about it as well. I think we get very excited when the world disarrays in such a way that the public and the private no longer matter. And I think that that's part of the appeal of Occupy Wall Street, is that everything is in the public arena. So, you know, you can go online and you can send pizzas and they get fed and people are feeding and people have to clean. And you know, all these things that happen in private space are out there happening in public space. And the same as the thinking about the issues that we're all living with every day and not having a space to articulate or being articulated there. It's exciting in a way when those barriers break down and there is this sense of public discourse that doesn't exist most of the time. But it's
I'm going to try and shape it into a question as much as I can, because thank you all for your presentations. And I mean, in my head, there's the intuitive and something that is all research-based in terms of the multiple practices that Walid, Shireen, and Ding, you all work in. But I think there's like a commonality at large, and that kind of reinforces itself with the political, which is that idea that we've all been attached to the aesthetic. I mean, what is that impulse that kind of pulls us into the aesthetic? And for me, I find it as that kind of liberational force, where art has always the possibility of what art could do, where no one else could possibly do that, where it could ruminate on the multiple disciplines or allow for that sphere of interaction and, let's say, expression that nobody else can actually manifest or gasp. And I think in that kind of way, how would you think about your various kind of practices as looking into that idea of providing for freedom and really looking at form and synthesis of the aesthetics that you've arrived at and capturing that aesthetic as an important realm that you do not want to let go of, because in letting go of the realm of the aesthetics, you're kind of letting go of the realm of freedom. I don't know if that's a cliche or if it makes sense, but I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, it's not an answer toward your question, but some of the issues that were talked about makes me think about the definition of activism. I mean, I think the issue of urgency, for example, it's a very different story if someone reads about, oh, what's going on in Wall Street, let me read about it. Oh yeah, I should be out there too. Or someone literally has been cut off from their family, or people are dying and they cannot enter. Or I mean, there are issues of urgency, and I think that the other thing that comes with activism is the question of community. I think as artists we're so used to being on our own, very solitary, and really believing in ourselves and talent and whatever we are collecting from the world, where once you're in a community, you become very selfless because it's no longer about you. It's really not about your art. It's about a communal cause. It's about a collective experience. And I love that because it really forces you to put the ego aside, which is fundamentally artists are born with this ego. And I think the thing I enjoyed about this experience, that was briefly, because up to now everything I did was political, but you know, in the background, was this idea of being part of a community that wanted change, and that change was going to affect my life. I was going to be able to see my family. I would be able, if things really worked out for democracy and freedom, then maybe I could go home after like so many years. You know, there are like personal things invested in this activism. It's not all that selfless, really. Is that we really want that change because we really would benefit from that. You know, our friends don't have to be in prison. And I think then, therefore, this activity, this participation is very different than women's right bill or economy or this and that. You know, I mean, our friends are in prison, and if I go and do some actions and collect signatures or get people to talk in the media, put pressure on the Iranian government, maybe he would be released. Do I really like to do this, like this kind of lobbying? No. But it's really possible for me not to help him if I can. I mean, these are the things, the question of urgency, that almost makes you irresponsible not to react to your community and to yourself. And so when we talk like this whole question becomes too general, and I feel like, in my case, because Iran is such an intense situation, and because, in fact, I have this experience of being separated from the country, is radically different from Walid, who can go to Lebanon, who could really reflect and have a distance. And I think, therefore, we can't really talk about it in this way. You know, I think we're talking too general. And therefore, the aesthetic, the language that I am having to articulate, it's within my own parameters. You know, it's a history of cinema in Iran, subversive, minimal, but really the sharp knife that those filmmakers have found in a way of expression, that even the government of Iran is being very savvy, understanding that sharpness of the knife. I mean, we have developed a language within the Iranian situation, the metaphors, the question of poetry, the question of magic realism, the kind of history of mysticism that we have utilized and have brought into a very contemporary level to use as a tool and as a way of resistance. Now, this is very specific to Iran. We cannot generalize this, and I realize today as I'm sitting here that I sound so, you know, I really, it's because we are experiencing a very, very intensive situation in Iran today. But you cannot, I think, I mean, in Vietnam, obviously they have censorship and all that, but they're not killing their artists. We're talking about executions. And so, you know, God, I hope you never get to that point. But certainly, if I arrive in Iran, I'll go straight to prison, as simple as that. Why? Because I'm an artist. I have not done anything wrong. Just think about that. And so this really, it empowers you in some ways, but it really makes you think that we're in such a particular situation that it's not really good to talk about it in such a general way. It's not fair to the other artists, I think.
You know, fantastic. I mean, in the context of that, if I can just take advantage also elaborating on this through your question about why Duchamp's urinal not like in the living room or the bath or the room, elaborating on what Tania Bruguera commented on. And in fact, it has to do with the specificity of linkage to the pipes, you know, to the system, in fact, to create this sort of...
Can't hear him? They're having trouble hearing you.
Yes, so I was saying I wanted to elaborate on the question that Walid asked about why not in the Duchamp urinal, not in the living room, which I guess is an extension of what Shireen was just saying now, but it was having to do with extending, again, Tania Bruguera's words, in fact connecting it to the pipes, to the very system that would enable a kind of two-way kind of corridor or linkage. On one hand, we already, I think, discussed it about this sort of need to enable a more functional relationship between art, let's say for a moment in the everyday, a kind of resonance of art into the sort of cultural and public imagination for a moment, which already Shireen suggested her dissatisfaction at times within the structures of art itself, trying to contact a broader audience for a moment, if we can say that. So on one hand, there is that, but on the other, I think there is a linkage to our own practices. And I'm thinking as a professor, again, for a moment, that teaches not in architectural school, but in the School of Art and the Visual Arts. Many times in my encounter with the students, I keep seeing how much, as artists, we also have been hiding behind this notion of free imagination, as if we have some kind of aura where we don't need to necessarily mess up or with institutions or with issues of responsibility or urgency. And I'm thinking that there is also a need to reconsider that, because only through entering, again, through an issue-based process that is sort of fundamentally based on the sense of urgency, that we begin to push, I think, in enabling other processes and enabling fundamentally other procedures. And finally is the other linkage on the other direction, which is maybe something that we haven't talked that much about today. What effect do we have in the institutions? If we were to do to the institutions what Duchamp's work did to the institutions of display, to the institutions of the art market, to the kind of, this is a kind of also issue that has been in my mind. I think that this is a moment to rethink the very frameworks, institutional frameworks, that have also been accomplices in producing such, such distance.
That's a wonderful place to stop, I think, because that's a whole other conference. So thank you all.
The time has come to stop and end, and it's a bit melancholy because this has been an unusually rich conference. And I have just one thought that I want to share as we close, and it's this, that when we were thinking about this conference on injured cities, we wanted to think about it in a kind of world context, partly to get away from American exceptionalism and parochialism, and also to be able to make visible the kinds of interconnections that make new kinds of violence and, this is a new word for me, infra-destruction possible. But in sitting through these 2 days, what's been really riveting to me is to refocus on the local strategies and the local tactics and practices by which people have found ways to see newly, to create a new kind of politics. And I think this is really important because I think it is on the terrain of the local that we will have the hope first of making a new kind of civic participation and politics possible. It's become a kind of cliche in the West right now that we've forgotten what government is for, that we can't remember that our taxes are really there for clean water and roads and not for security and surveillance and the military. And I think we've also forgotten what civic participation actually looked like. And it's not really just about voting, but about protesting, organizing, filming, dancing, all the things that we've been talking about in the last few days, and doing it with others and for a common goal. So I want to thank all our participants for the last 2 days for reminding us of this great lexicon of possibility that they have helped us to see in all the local sites that they've talked about. So I would like us all to thank them now, collectively. And I'd also like us to thank those acts of creativity which Marianne Hirsch and Kate Trebas in particular have displayed in putting together this collective event, which is the conference. And so, safe travels to you all.